Okay. Well, it's good to see everybody today, Wednesday, January 29th. As I was saying before I started recording, it's always an issue wondering whether we're going to have class when I cancel classes, and I don't cancel class lightly. There are other extenuating circumstances that arise, like last Wednesday having to meet with families and prepare for four funerals that occurred, two on Thursday, two on Friday last week. So the life of a rabbi isn't just about leading adult education sessions. It's lots of things. So the Torah portion this week is Bo, and it begins on page 374 in the Eitz Chaim, or chapter 10 of the book of Exodus. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So this portion really is the climax of the plagues and the encounter, Moses' encounter with Pharaoh. This unlikely story of a son of slaves being adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the palace, murdering an Egyptian taskmaster for his evil treatment of a Hebrew slave, who runs away for his life to the desert kingdom of Midian, and there falls in love by the well, because it's another story of a well, with Tzipporah, and marries her, and then encounters God on Mount Sinai. So all of those details in and of itself are really hard to imagine that they could be true, and they are the stuff of great storytelling, which has been retold in movies since the Ten Commandments in the 1950s, and Steven Spielberg's movie, animated movie, and other movies about this. So it makes for a great story. And Midrash, the rabbinic Midrash, adds even more fanciful details to the story to add to the whole miraculous nature of what happened in Egypt. And so the key to the story is for the Torah is that this all proves God's hand in determining events, and that nothing is beyond God's power. All right, so that the Torah wants us to learn that important message and lesson about theology. God is everything, and is all-knowing, and is all-powerful, and everything that happens is because God wants it to happen. So that's not just with the grand Exodus, the parting of the sea and the exodus of the Jews from Egypt, but it's also in the little details of who the people are in the story, each and every one of them, and how miraculous it is that the turn of events happen in such a way that the story can unfold in the way that it does. So now I must also say that there's no proof at all that anything that happened in the story actually happened. There is no archaeological evidence for anything in this story. So, and that's true for the entire Torah. We have no proof of anything that the five books of Moses describes as happening in the story as events from Genesis 1 till the end of Deuteronomy chapter 34. Nothing. We have no evidence at all. That's not to say that it didn't happen. All of that is to say that it just adds to the nature of the story itself. Is the story myth? And so ancient as it can be, still myth, or is it true? And so I've said over the years, and other people within the Jewish community have said this over the years, it doesn't matter, really, whether it's true or not. What matters is how we, as a Jewish people, have responded to the story itself. Okay? And because the story takes a central role in all of Judaism, and that lots of what we do is in remembering the Exodus from Egypt, then whether it really happened or not doesn't matter. What matters is that we think it happened, and that elements of the story are important because it shapes who we are as a Jewish people. All right, our story is such that we're descended from Abraham and Sarah. We end up in Egypt. We become slaves, and miraculously, because God heard our cry, we were saved from Egypt. All right, not too many other people in the history of peoples around the world have a story in which the beginning is tragic. In other words, most other societies have a glorious beginning. But the Jewish people has a story of slavery that is the start of who they are as a people. All right, so I just wanted to start with that kind of background so that we keep this in mind as we are reading the weekly Torah portions, and this portion also serves as a transition, an actual narrative transition between from the people as a family of the Israelites to the nation of the Israelites, and that transition is marked in chapter 12. So we'll look at chapter 12 in a few minutes. I want to look first at page 376 in the second Aliyah. So the middle of the second Aliyah to the end of the second Aliyah is the end of the plague of locusts, which is plague 8, and the beginning of the plague of darkness, which is the 9th plague. So I want to look at that. So it starts with verse 16 on page 376. So it's chapter 10, verse 16. And so I want to read from 16 through 23 to the end of the second Aliyah. Vayamaher Paro likro leMoshe ula Aharon vayomer chatati laAdonai Elohechem velachem. So Pharaoh hastens to call Moses and Aaron, and he says, I have sinned before God, your God, and to you. So, the plague of locusts occurs, the crops of Egypt are destroyed, and Pharaoh now is asking that the plague stop. So he's asking in a way, okay, I'll admit that I've sinned to your God and to you. All right, so this is a remarkable statement for Pharaoh to say, because Pharaoh is God. For all of Egypt, he is God. So for him to admit that there is another God, it takes a lot, and it took 8 plagues for him to say it, but he says it. But then, 8:17, Ve'ata sana chatati achapa'am, ve'ha'atiru la'adonai Elohechem, ve'yaser me'alai rak et hamavet hazeh. And now, raise up my sin, take this sin off of me this one time, and pray to God, your God, that this death would be taken off of me, or remove this death from me. So he's imploring to Moses, not to God directly, but to Moses, who's clearly God's intermediary. He's imploring Moses to pray to God to relieve this death from Egypt. 18, Vayetse me'im paro, vayater el Adonai. So he, Moses, leaves Pharaoh's presence and prays to God. So yeah, he does Pharaoh's bidding, prays to God to stop the plague of locusts. 19, Vayahafoch Adonai ruach yam chazak ma'od, vayisa et ha'arbe, vayitkaehu yama suf. Lo nishar arbe echad b'chol gevul Mitzrayim. So God caused a strong west wind. Well, it could be translated a wind from the sea. So now in Egypt, the sea is north. In Israel, the sea is west. So I can understand. So in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, Yama means to the sea, but it also means west, because in the land of Israel, the sea is the west. Negba is to the Negev, but that is also to the south. But you can also say Taimana, where Yemen is, towards Yemen. That's also south, but all related to the geography of Israel. So a Ruach Yam, is that really a westward, a west wind? It's west wind if we're talking Israel, but we're in Egypt. So it would be a north wind. So that's why I think it's better to say the wind coming from the direction of the sea. Okay, so in this case, it's coming from the north. A very strong northerly wind comes and carries the locusts and hurls it into the Yam Suf, which is the very Yam Suf that the Israelites are going to cross to leave Egypt. So what is that Sea of Reeds? We don't know. So that doesn't matter. It's not the Red Sea, because on maps of Israel, maps that are printed in Israel, has the Red Sea listed as Yam Suf. Okay, so if you could picture so there's the Gulf of Eilat, that's how it's called in Israel. It's kind of like Trump saying it's the Gulf of America versus the Gulf of Mexico. In Israel, it's the Gulf of Eilat. For the rest of the world, it's the Gulf of Aqaba, okay, because Eilat and Aqaba are right next door to each other in Israel and in Jordan, and that body of water that's right there is the Gulf of Eilat or Aqaba, which leads into, at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, into the Red Sea. Okay, so that, on maps in Israel, in Hebrew, the Red Sea is called Yam Suf. So that's not the Yam Suf that is mentioned here. That it can't, that all scholars agree that is not the Sea of Reeds that the people crossed. Most scholars agree that it is somewhere along wherever the Suez Canal is, leading to that body of water that is on, in your mind's eye, the left side of the Sinai Peninsula. So that's the Gulf of Suez. Okay, so the Gulf of Suez ends, and then the Suez Canal is built to connect the Gulfs of Suez, the Mediterranean Sea, the Gulf of Suez, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Give me a moment until my throat clears. So before the Suez Canal was built, there was just sand there and some other bodies of water. So it's possible Yam Suf is somewhere along that strip that connects, that is on the left side of the Sinai Peninsula, what is entirely in Egypt today. Or until 1982, when Israel gave it back, it divided Israel from Egypt. Okay, so God caused a wind from the sea to blow strong, to carry the locust, hurl them into the Sea of Reeds, wherever that is, and there was not one single locust that was left in the land, the entire land of Egypt. Okay? 20. So Pharaoh acknowledges God's existence, says, I have sinned to God, asks Moses to pray to God to stop this plague. Moses does, God does it, and it should be clear then that in all of Egypt sees this happen, right? If the locusts had overrun Egypt in its entirety, or let's just say this, the whole Nile River fertile basin. So, like if you could picture a map of Egypt in your mind, the Nile River goes from the Mediterranean all the way down to the bottom of Egypt, and really the fertile land of Egypt is a couple miles on either side of the Nile. So the locusts were in that fertile area. The locusts, there's nothing for them to eat in the desert, so they're not going to be in the desert. So they're not in all of Egypt. They're in all of the Nile region of Egypt. So, and that's where most of the people live, where they can raise their food. So all of Egypt sees or feels the wind blowing from a different direction, and then they watch the locusts go away. Okay, verse 20. Vayechazek, so we're chapter 10, verse 20, page 376 in the Eitz Chaim. Vayechazek Adonai et lev Paro, velo shilach et bnei Yisrael. And God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go. So there's a lot to be said about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And the below-the-line commentary on 374 talks about it. The commentary in last week's portion talks about it. So how do we understand the hardening of Pharaoh's heart? So it's from my understanding of what the Torah is human response to events and also stories related to the Jewish people. And it's a theological response, a spiritual response to these events and stories. So what I mean by that is, so as an example, the The State of Israel is established in 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II. Some could see that as a spiritual event. That, in other words, the State of Israel could only have been established through God's intervention in human history. And one can then thank God for the creation of the State of Israel. That would be a legitimate way of understanding the course of human events from 1945 to 1948. That would be one way to do it. There are political, military, sociological, other ways of understanding the course of events. But one can also view those events through a religious lens. So that's how I understand the Torah. The Torah is an understanding of events through a religious lens. So, if there was a Pharaoh, well, we know there was a Pharaoh because there's proof that there were pharaohs in Egypt. If the people of Israel were enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt and they were let free by the Pharaoh of Egypt, how were the Israelites freed? What were the course of events that occurred that enabled them to be free? And how do we understand the course of events happening? So those events could be understood as plagues. Now, I remember clearly in the Hertz Chumash, that is the blue one that we used to use, and all synagogues in America would use the Hertz Chumash. Orthodox, conservative, Reformed synagogues would use the Hertz Chumash. It was the Chumash that was used in all American synagogues until the Eitz Chaim was published. In the Hertz Chumash, Rabbi Hertz tries to explain the plagues scientifically, and that there could be a real event that occurred that could explain each of these plagues. So, okay, if people need proof in order to believe in the Torah, well, I think that's kind of sad that we need that. Like in other words, he says the plague of darkness, which is about to happen. I mean, locusts are common throughout the Middle East. So the fact that they were so invasive at this one time, okay. But the plague of darkness, which is about to happen, he says, is as a result of a volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean, which caused the ash to spread throughout the area and make it seem as if it's dark. It covered the sun. And there is some proof that he brings and shows what year, in the 1300s BCE, there was some volcanic eruption, and he claims that that was the plague of darkness. And that the miracle is that all of these scientific, the way that we can explain all these plagues scientifically is that they happen in such consecutive order and in such a way as that. Again, for me, it's not necessary to prove it. It's just things happened, and it's being explained in this religious way. Why did Pharaoh not let the people go? It must be that God hardened his heart. That could be one way of explaining it. We could explain that about political leaders today. Why does President Trump do what he's doing? There are some who support President Trump who say that God is telling him what to do. Okay, are they wrong in doing that? I clearly don't believe in it, but why should it be any different than over the ages thinking that God is acting through other people throughout history? Okay, so we just have to ask, if we think God acts through people, then who decides which people God's acting through? and which people God isn't acting through. Who is a prophet and who isn't a prophet? Say what we want about the person, Reverend Martin Luther King, but no one can argue that his I Have a Dream speech is one of the greatest speeches in the history of humanity. And one could argue that he was prophetic in that moment in 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. You could argue that. Not too many people would argue against it, but there were people who would argue against what Reverend King was preaching. So my point is, for the Torah, the perspective is clear. God acts in history. God acts on purpose in history. And God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. And we could try to explain it away to make it make sense. There's no way to make sense of the story in a way that we will be theologically or morally satisfied. We will be morally satisfied in that slaves are freed, but we're not morally satisfied that in the process, Egyptians died. Okay, so we're morally satisfied that hostages are being released, and 3 more hostages will be released tomorrow, along with 5, so 3 Israelis and 5 Thailand citizens will be released tomorrow. We're absolutely overjoyed that they're being released. But at the same time, so in other words, there's no clear 100% moral happiness usually in the world. There is no such thing. That the happiness comes at some kind of expense. And the expense for Israel with the release of the hostages is recognizing that Hamas is still alive and well, and having to watch the evil propaganda and drama play out that Hamas does as it releases the Israeli hostages. That's morally reprehensible to watch that, but at the same time, we're happy that the hostages are being released. So we're happy when we read the story of the Exodus from Egypt. We're happy when we reenact it every year at Passover. But it's in the telling of the story in which we kind of make choices in telling the story, right? So when we tell the story to our children, and we have little children around the table, we're not going to get into like the moral quagmire of the story, right? We're going to get into all the fun of the Israelites being freed and how joyous we should be that God answered our cry and we were freed from Egypt. That's just the easier way to kind of leave everything else out of the story and just focus on that. But as grown-ups, we can appreciate we have to be distracted by the other parts of the story. And so this idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart is one of these moral distractions that we have to deal with. Okay, because however people become free, other people have to die in the process. Does there come a point when everybody deserves to die in order to make people free? Right? In other words, was it morally right to drop atom bombs on Japan in order to end World War II? I have no idea. I have no idea if that's right. I wasn't alive during the time to understand the evil of Japan at the time. And was there no other way to end the war? I don't know. I really don't know. But these are the moral questions that we're left with, and we don't know. We hope and pray that we do the best we can in navigating life today, that we make the best choices that we can. But we understand that in the Torah itself, people were not making the best choices, and that's just our fate. That we just never we always do not make the right choice. Okay, so a little bit more here, verse 21. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Nete yadcha al hashamayim, v'yehi choshech al eretz Mitzrayim, vayamesh choshech. So God said to Moses, stretch out your arm to the heavens, to the sky, to the heavens, and darkness will appear. There will be darkness over the land of Egypt. Now, the Vayamesh Choshech, it's translated here, hold out your arm toward the sky that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, comma, a darkness that can be touched. Vayamesh Choshech, a darkness that can be touched. So, let's read the two more verses that are about this plague. Vayet Moshe et yado al hashamayim, vayehi choshech afela, b'chol eretz Mitzrayim shloshet yamim. So Moses stretched out his arm to the heavens, and there was not a darkness that you can touch. That word isn't used again. This is choshech afela. So afela is like fog. So a dark fog. Or this says a thick darkness. So a dark fog, a thick darkness happened in the land of Egypt for 3 days. So there's darkness, and now there's thick darkness. So if you think about it, if it's dark, isn't it dark enough? So what does thick darkness mean? So now there could be dark, and there could be like a sliver of light that you can see. So in other words, like when we go to sleep at night in our rooms, in our bedrooms, I would imagine that our bedrooms are not 100% light free. So it's dark. We could have room darkening shades, but there's always some kind of light that's there, that it's not completely dark, that our eyes can get used to the darkness and we'd see something, like we know where the edge of the bed is. We know we can make our way to the bathroom if we need to. We know where the bureau is, that kind of thing, because there's some kind of light seeping through. So that's not the darkness here. The darkness here is like being in a 100% light-free room. And there are rooms like this. So there's a museum in children's, well, no, it's not children's museum. There's a museum in Israel that tries to help people understand what it means to be blind, and also what it means to be deaf. So the blind room, somehow Lenore and I had heard about this museum, and when we were there once, years ago, when the kids were smaller, we took them to this museum. The blind room is this room that is 100% without light. And it's kind of scary, because no matter how wide your eyes are open, you cannot see a thing. So that could be the kind of darkness this was, the darkness that lasted for 3 days. 23, Lo ra'u ish et achiv, velo kamu ish mitachtav, shloshet yamim, ulachol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam. A person could not see his brother A person could not get up from under him for 3 days. That's how terrible this darkness was, because you couldn't make your way around. You could not, you have lost all sense of perspective. You couldn't function. But for the people of Israel, there was light in their dwelling places. So now, what kind of darkness was it? So let's look down below the line, because it's just interesting. Is this physically, literally darkness, or what is it? So if we look below the line on 376, the Midrash calls the plague of darkness the darkness of hell, or Gehinnom, and it connects the darkness that afflicted Egypt with the primordial darkness that existed before God said, "Let there be light." Right? So we have to remember the beginning of the book of Genesis, chapter 1, V'choshech al pnei tahom, and there was darkness over this existence, this mass that was the earth. Just as the light of Shabbat is a foretaste of the world to come, right? There is this sense in the Midrash that Shabbat every week is a taste of the world to come. So like we're creating a kind of a version on earth of the world to come. Like the menu for Shabbat meals is supposed to be a taste of what we're going to be eating in the world to come. That gefilte fish, for example, is a taste of the food that we're going to be eating, and that is, according to the rabbis, we're eating Leviathan. And Leviathan is this huge sea creature, according to the Midrash, that God subdued and killed in order to create the world and make it inhabitable for human beings. And so what did God do with that Leviathan? Well, he used the skin of it for the sukkah that's up in the world to come, and the flesh will be what we eat in the world to come. So gefilte fish then is this food that we eat on Shabbat to give us the taste of the world to come. So there are other spiritual things about Shabbat itself that is this taste of the world to come. So like the gefilte fish part, that's funny, but it's not funny, because it's like, look, for Jews living in a time of persecution and oppression, Jews need hope. So every little thing that we do can give us hope for the future. So in a time of oppression, a jar of Manischewitz gefilte fish can give you a little bit of hope that this is a taste in the world to come. And I laugh about it because I'm not living in a time of oppression. But I can imagine that in terrible times, you want to do something to say that there's still hope for the future. And even something as mundane as eating a piece of gefilte fish can be a hope for the future. Okay, so just as the light of Shabbat is a foretaste of the world to come, so we're on the bottom, below the line on 377, the reward that awaits the righteous, that is the world to come, the darkness of the ninth plague is a foretaste of Gehinnom, the punishment that awaits those who cannot truly see their neighbors, who cannot feel the pain and recognize the dignity of their afflicted neighbors. Okay, so that what's described here in verse 23 about a person can't see his brother and they couldn't get up from under them is for the Midrash a kind of a little bit of a sense of what the opposite of the world to come is. The world to come is all beauty and tranquility and harmony, and Gehinnom is the opposite. So it's darkness and not light. Okay, so one idea here is that this is not a literal thing that we're reading. It's a metaphor for the future, and that if we're good, we get the world to come. If we're bad, we get this, like what the plague of darkness is describing. But then it goes on, 23, below the line, during all the other plagues, the average Egyptian could do nothing to end them. During a plague of darkness, however, could Egyptians not light candles? Right. So, in other words, no matter how dark it is, you can feel around your house to know where the fireplace is, and you should be able to light the fire, or at least light a candle, and overcome the plague of darkness. Perhaps the plague, so it goes on, was not a physical darkness, a sandstorm, or a solar eclipse. Eclipses last for a few minutes, never for 3 days, right? Just or what Hertz described maybe a volcanic eruption. Perhaps, so it wasn't something physical, perhaps it was a spiritual or psychological darkness, a deep depression. So like that afela, the choshech afela, the dark fog, could be like a fog that we feel inside of ourselves if we are depressed. Like if we're sick with the flu, we kind of feel like something, we just like there's some, like we're walking in a haze, right? If you've been that sick before with the flu or a really bad cold or something like that, you kind of feel like you're walking through some kind of haze. So imagine then if one mentally, mental health-wise, is feeling depressed, you can imagine walking through that haze all the time. And then no matter what you do, there's no medicine that can help relieve the symptoms. So the commentary goes on. The word melancholy comes from a Greek root meaning dark mood. People suffering from depression lack the energy to move about or to be concerned with anyone other than themselves, precisely as the Torah describes the Egyptians. Perhaps the Egyptians were depressed by the series of calamities that had struck them, or by the realization of how much their own comfort depended on the enslavement of others. The person who cannot see his neighbor is incapable of spiritual growth, incapable of rising from where he is currently. In Jewish legal discussion, defining how early one may recite the morning prayers, dawn is defined as when one can recognize the face of a friend. When one can see other people and recognize them as friends, the darkness has begun to lift. All right, so there is this way among the rabbis over the centuries to see the progression of the plagues as not physical, actual things that are happening in the land of Egypt, but psychological, spiritual things that are happening to the mindset of the Egyptian people and to Pharaoh himself. And it gets to the point of of mental depression, and then there's the death of the firstborn, which will be the 10th plague. So it's just interesting to see that, and this just also gets back to my point about the Torah itself. Is the Torah actually an accurate depiction of what happened, or is it a human response to events, whether they happened or not, but a way of teaching moral and religious lessons about life? And so here, if we're talking about the creation or the formation of the people of Israel, what does it mean to be formed out of these events that are happening here, out of these plagues? And what does it mean? It's for the kind of people that we should be ourselves, that we need to avoid the spiritual melancholy that the Egyptians feel, and always try to pursue the opposite of the melancholy, but that is a life of light, a life that would be defined by a covenant with God. Okay, so that everything that we read in the Torah is a metaphor then for how we're supposed to be leading our lives. So, thoughts, questions, or comments about this? All right. So as is usual, even though I had a plan to do something else from the portion two, we don't exactly have enough time for that. So we'll stop here for today. Hope everybody has a good rest of the day, and we look forward tomorrow to the release of more hostages from Gaza. Take care,
Thank
everybody.